Open University.
Hello students, welcome to my balcony. It's not really my balcony. Well, it is a picture of me talking apparently on my balcony, but I'm actually recording indoors in the room in Lisbon. You caught me last time really thinking about whether I wanted to go to India or Vietnam, spend maybe 3 weeks there, or the closest to that, to an Asian place in Europe, a place which is cheap and quite funky, and I chose Lisbon. And I'm here for 3 weeks, and so far I'm absolutely loving it, and it's the ideal decompression chamber between East and West, because I'm here in the Asian district, sort of Chinese. On one side of my hotel, it's Chinese street on the boulevard there. On the other side is a Bangladeshi street. And so it's very much an Asian ambience, and I'm eating sort of Asian food and living in a culture, in a country which has been itself a go-between between the East and the West, because of course in 1543 the Portuguese arrived in Japan, and this started a series of commercial and cultural exchanges between East and West, which continued. The Dutch are also very, very instrumental when they came to Dejima. But it was the Portuguese who were the first, and you still have the word arigato, for instance, in Japanese. Thank you comes from obrigado, which is thank you in Portuguese. And you can hear maybe Japanese people will talk about zavihage. That means a kind of tonsured, bald head, and it comes from Xavier, who was the Jesuit missionary who came with that first. So it was a double-headed attack. It was commercial and it was religious, and therefore ambivalent. I feel ambivalent about that, because I like the idea of East and West trading with each other, but I don't like the idea of imposing. I also went back and read a piece I wrote in 2003, which was called 1998 Forever, on the iMomus website, and that was a description, a think piece, based on my first trip here to Lisbon. And that's kind of interesting too, because it's about exchanges which are either one-way or two-way. I don't think the Jesuits were really learning very much about Shinto, for instance, and this is what I start talking about in this 1998 Forever piece. I talk about whether cities are finished or unfinished, and essentially an unfinished city is something like Berlin. The feeling I had when I moved to Berlin, which I'd just done when I wrote this actually in 2003, is that it was a city which wanted to learn from me as much as it wanted to teach me, whereas Paris was a finished city. It was like a museum. It just wanted to teach me about its history. It didn't have anything to take on board from me. There was no genuine exchange when I went to Paris. Berlin, because it had some extra capacity, some sort of infrastructural margin, and also a certain sense of constant flux, it really did seem to need my input, and that was very seductive for me. That's why I chose Berlin over Paris when I came back to Europe from Tokyo, from New York. I just read a little bit what I wrote here. Whole cities can feel finished or unfinished. Edinburgh, my hometown, is finished. There's not much left there to do. They got it right. They slapped conservation orders on all the buildings. Bring on the tourists. Park the coaches. Paris is finished. Don't litter, don't spoil it. Admire the Baron Haussmann's vistas. Build new stuff only on the outskirts. Bring on the tourists. Skipping forward. So talk about my first impressions of Lisbon. It strikes me as a finished city. It's intriguingly confused, though. Finished in the manner of a mosaic, cluttered like a junk shop. It has 7 hills like Rome, a big suspension bridge like the one in San Francisco, a small wrought iron tower designed by Eiffel of Paris fame, a big Jesus statue with outstretched arms like the one in Rio. It has a fake fortress built by a recent fascist dictator. I actually can see that from my hotel bedroom here. And a huge quantity of very old, very lovely ceramic tiled buildings. It has South American style boulevards called things like Avenida da Liberdade, 70s air-conditioned prestige hotel towers, slum blocks on the outskirts, and gross new sports arenas in green and yellow. Like other finished cities, Lisbon is mostly old. The new architecture is in designated development areas. And that's a bit like the site of Expo 98. So I'm kind of riffing a lot on Expo 98, stamping a kind of late 90s character onto Lisbon. And I stumbled on a thing called Experimenta Design 2003, Beyond Consumption, which was a biennial event, a design event, which was happening all over the city, but mostly in rather funky old buildings in the Baitha area. I think it's pronounced Baitha. And that was trying to suggest, government-funded, trying to suggest Lisbon as a hub of creative activity, a hot, molten city capable of accepting new shapes and forms. And so I'm kind of a bit skeptical of that. And I'm thinking in that about design itself and design's aspirations. And that starts me off thinking about things like design is something Panglossian. Dr. Pangloss in Voltaire's Candide is eternally optimistic about the future. Everything's for the best in the best of all possible worlds, he says. And of course, Candide, the novel, starts in the Lisbon earthquake. It's all about the impact the Lisbon earthquake had on this kind of 18th century optimism. The future is not always for the best, and terrible things happen, disasters happen. And that is the banana skin that design is always slipping on. This was very much the theme of my records at the time. Oscar Tennis Champion was very much about architecture, the Bauhaus, and design coming up against the tragedies and ridiculous slips of the real world. And therefore Jacques Tati is the key figure in that album. It's Walter Gropius versus Jacques Tati, essentially. So the Lisbon earthquake, thank God it hasn't been shaking while I've been here. I don't think it's shaken for quite a few decades or even centuries in Lisbon. But it is, like Japan, another thing that connects it to the Orient is this potential for destruction by earthquakes. I remember something David Bowie once said about how the most exciting thing in his life was travel and the unfamiliarity of the first hours in a new city. So that's really what I'm sort of capturing in this 2003 essay, describing hanging out at the lounging space at the Cinema São Jorge on the Avenue de Liberdade. People like Animal Collective were there. I ran into Animal Collective and Rusty Santos, who went on to produce my 2006 album, Oki Milk. And but a lot of what they're projecting as the future of Lisbon reminds me of the past of London. Internet cafes, kind of organic, gloopy, organic design. It seemed already retro by 2003, and then I'm projecting forward to 2008. That then was the future, of course, and wondering where the world was going, because already the sort of post 9/11 pessimism had set in. There were new wars, and it seemed like the future was just going to be kind of grim stuff, which, you know, by and large, it has been compared with the 90s. The 90s was an optimistic decade. So I'm not seeing this time around, I'm not seeing a lot of these this sort of design stuff and the optimistic, futuristic stuff that I was seeing on my first visit to Lisbon. But it's still a very pleasant place, and I've had a great time here. So I'm going to continue this by talking you through some of the photos I've been taking. So I arrived from Luxembourg on an EasyJet flight, which was kind of late night and kind of bumpy, actually, over the, I suppose, the mountains in the north of Spain. I booked basically 3 weeks in a hotel in the Bangladeshi area, but I was in the first night. I had to book an extra night in a different hotel, and that was an even more Bangladeshi hotel. It was called Lisbon Bangla, and that was really amazingly Bangladeshi. There were sort of strip lights and no coat hangers and sofas in the room, but the staff were really sweet, and I really feel at home always in Bangladeshi environments. And so the next day I went to the flea market, which is one of my favourite things to do in any city, really, especially in Lisbon, though. It's near the Pantheon. I'm not sure how Panglossian a flea market is. A flea market essentially suggests that all the optimism about the future is in the past, and that's what I tend to have an eye for when I look around the market. I went again today because it's Saturdays and Tuesdays. Today's Tuesday, and what I essentially look for in flea markets, I think, is sort of late 60s, early 70s design in books and in, products, tape recorders, cameras, whatever, because it reminds me of a time of optimism about the past. Ironically, one of the things I saw today was a children's cut-out card of Apollo 13, which included flames, presumably for you to put at the bottom of the rocket, but of course Apollo 13 was the one that burst into flames on the launch site, and so you can put those flames, cut them out and put them on the top of the rocket as well if you want. So I looked around the flea market and then checked into my long-term hotel. In the flea market on Saturday I found ridiculous sawn-off denim jackets with Pessoa on the back. I mean, silly touristy stuff that makes no sense, because Pessoa was always very carefully turned out in classical black suits and hats.
70 me's from the same egg hatched, Siamese twins unattached, souls impatient with their limits, each one trying to be what it isn't. The meaning of my life has been to dream, to casually observe what I think I mean, to fill my hands with sand colored gold, open my fingers and out it rolls. I am happy to be no one, the outskirts of an non-existent town, the margins of a withering page, prologue to an unwritten age. If what happens to me happens to you, then to tell you tells you nothing new. But if what happens to me happens only to me, nothing I can say will ever make you see. The past is all I fail to be, the future all I've yet to be. Sick of having just one me, I created 70.
By woodside grow the woodland rushes. There's hush and crush and brush and bushes.
The constant tiles throughout the city just really inspiring to me, especially when they're combined with hazard stripes and bright colours from a kind of utilitarian present. But they sign up a certain dandyism, which I find very interesting. You have the north-south thing. I mean, a North European like me feels there's a kind of southern sensuality and exoticism in the PIGS countries, the South European countries, Portugal, Italy, Spain, Greece. But also in particular, I mean, the tiles look particularly Islamic, and of course there's been a long Islamic occupation here, as there was in Spain. Tiles obviously date from that, because sometimes you feel you could be in Isfahan or something, you could be in Iran or North Africa, but also they bespeak a certain dandyism. And the second museum, I went on Sunday to 3 museums. I went to the Puppet Museum, the Antiquities Museum, and the Oriental Museum. They were delightfully empty. I have to say, it's a tourist city, but the tourists don't seem to go to these museums, and that's fine with me. They're enormous museums, particularly the Oriental Museum down at the docks. Huge, and really there were like 6 people there. 3 floors of this stuff and a fantastic exhibition of Cantonese opera. I was the only person on that level for hours, So I just sat there watching all the films of the Cantonese opera, looking at the costumes and things. But the best thing, the most interesting thing, the least interesting museum for me was the Antiquities one. But the best thing in that was very interesting, and that was a screen from a Japanese screen of the arrival of the Portuguese in Japan in 1543. So it's 4 screens actually from attributed to Kano Domi, made in Japan in the late 14th century and 16th century. Wooden lattice covered with paper, gold leaf, tempera painting, silk, lacquer, and copper gilt. So the amazing thing is just the kind of the dandyism of the Portuguese as they're depicted there. They have black slaves, they have peacocks, they have camels and elephants with them, and not elephants, I think, just camels. And they have these amazing billowing trousers, these very rounded, I guess influenced by the Moorish occupation, the Islamic influence there. These huge Baghdad-style trousers, and I guess monkeys, and apparently the Japanese thought they were like extraterrestrials. They're also referred to as the barbarians from the south, Nambanjin. It's funny because there's an area of Osaka called Namba. I guess it wouldn't mean south, Osaka. Minami is literally south. But yeah, they arrived at Nagasaki. So they arrived in way down south, Japan. And there was curiosity, and there was a certain festivity also when they arrived amongst the Japanese. They were by no means feared or resented, I think. So these screens really show you essentially dandies, you know. The way they're dressed, they have these high-peaked hats and billowing trousers. So I sat for a long time studying those with French people who were sort of conveniently reading out the texts, the museum's texts about this. And yeah, the puppet museum I really loved. That was free as well, actually, amazing. And what was so great about that was that puppets are, in some way, puppets are a role model for me. I mean, I put the kind of crazy clothes that puppets wear, I guess quite similar to clowns' clothes, in the kind of category of what I'm looking for when I'm trying to find second-hand clothes in markets. So there's a connection with flea markets. Obviously, the puppets, which are called Robertos in Portuguese, they used to pop up on beaches and on streets, and, you know, puppeteers spoke with these kind of reed kazoo-like things in their mouths, so that their voices carried over the sound of the traffic. And they also dressed up the puppets in these ludicrous garbs. Puppets have been very important in my work, as important as masks, really. The idea of the mask as the persona that allows you to perhaps even be more genuine, to reveal real things about yourself precisely because you're using a mask. But if you look at the first video I had the chance to make was the Hairstyle of the Devil video, and that features puppets basically playing out sort of real characters, a triangular situation I was involved in at the time. I decided to use puppets rather than actors, you know. I live in a city now which is famous for its puppet theatre, the Bunraku Theatre in Osaka, and there's in the latest album there's also a video featuring puppets, which is the Yale Shoki puppets featured in the video for Twister, and I find them very resonant. I think Whale Shoki, he was influenced rather by the Islamic ban on representations of the human figure, which certainly in Indonesia has caused puppets to be extremely unrealistic and fantastical and grotesque monsters. You can show monsters, you can't show people in the Islamic tradition. It's one of the reasons pattern has been, tiles have been so important, that, you know, you can't have representations of deities, certainly, and even just normal humans either, on the walls, and so instead you have these patterns. So I was looking at these, and they have a really eclectic world collection of puppets in there, in the museum, looking at them as really for dress tips, because puppets can get away with a lot of really visually interesting stuff. Some of them are wearing sarongs, and they have fantastical facial hair, and some are literally shadow puppets from Indonesia, from Java, and some are like whale shorkies. They're glass puppets, and so I was looking at these and just you know, photographing everything for the fantastic costume, and that kind of joined up later on with the costume in the Cantonese opera. The extremely mannerist style of Cantonese opera, where it's combined with acrobatics and with gestural theatre, like kabuki theatre, or like no plays in Japan. But basically, you have decades of training to master all these different arts of singing, dancing, jumping, acrobatics, gesture, musical skills, and this influenced my 2002 album Oscar Tennis Champion quite a bit, because I was having frequented dumpling bars in New York where they played Cantonese opera. I suddenly got curious about this highly artificial way of singing, they use in Cantonese opera. And so I went in 2004 to Hong Kong for the first time, and actually went to the theatre and saw Cantonese opera there, and really, really enjoyed that. But it's a place, the Puppet Theatre and the Cantonese Opera Exhibition, they're both places where you can, you see bright colours, you see people wearing clothes, you see figures wearing clothes, which are incredibly bright and interesting to look at. So that I found very interesting, very inspiring, and the streets themselves are dandyish in the same way. You know, the buildings are not content just with having stone, they have to have these facades of tile. And what particularly catches my eye as a photographer is when the one set of tiling has been interrupted by another set in a kind of almost random way, and it actually looks great. And the same thing actually on the ground. You have these tiled pavements which are very slippery. I just have a pair of flip-flops with me, and I'm sort of dreading the rain, because it's full of very steep hills on these very slippery marble pavements, and flip-flops are just going to be treacherous. If it rains, we're going to have to buy some rubber shoes. So, yeah, that was my weekend, and what did I do Monday? Monday, I went shopping, bought lots of... I didn't buy ginja, which is the traditional Portuguese cherry liqueur, but I just bought lots of stuff like chickpeas and olives and things, and poked my nose into a church. I'm still jet lagged, so I wake up at 3 in the morning basically and wait hours for anything to open, and then head out. Oh yeah, one thing I discovered on Monday was the Goethe Institute, which is just up the hill from here and has fantastic gardens out the back, has a German library as well. So that was again a decompression kind of environment for me to, because I've just come from the German-speaking world. I arrived in Frankfurt and spent a day or so in Frankfurt before I went to Luxembourg. And shopping, particularly in the Oxfam bookshop in Frankfurt, that was the highlight of the Frankfurt trip, seeing books by my favourite authors. So the first thing I did in the library in the Goethe Institute was look for books by Boto Strauss, Arno Schmidt, and Brecht, of course, Peter Hanke, Max Frisch. You know, it's not a great library. It's not as huge as I thought it might be. Not as big as the one in London, for instance. Quite a surprisingly limited selection. But the coffee bar in the gardens out the back of the Goethe Institute in Lisbon is really great. So the weather, of course, has been gorgeous, blue skies every day, and I'm just walking around and shooting pictures. And yeah, it's a great walking city. I think I was saying that the alternatives I thought of going to in Vietnam or in India would have been a little stressful, just having to dodge motorbikes all the time. Very few motorbikes in Lisbon. There aren't the giant wasps which make life in Berlin right now so miserable. Late summer in Germany is pretty awful because of wasps. There are almost no mosquitoes as well. It's actually really perfect. There's a nice breeze which is always coming in off the sea here in Lisbon, which keeps the real heat off you, keeps you refreshed all the time. So, yeah, I've just been schlepping about and taking pictures of tiles and going to the market whenever possible. I've discovered a new drink which is a lychee concentrate, and yeah, I basically been reading. Actually, already I've accumulated a whole shelf of books. I can talk you through the books as well. Yeah, I found this English language bookshop called Beaver Books, and I got a Penguin anthology of short stories, which is actually a little bit feet of clay, actually a little bit stolid. But I also got E.M. Forster's The Longest Journey novel, which I began and sort of enjoyed. A little bit in the sort of the mode of Aldous Huxley or Evelyn Waugh, that kind of period. Catherine Mansfield, The Garden Party, I've been carrying with me, brought that from Japan, and Virginia Woolf's Diary, and those are all, there are sort of strong connections between those three because they all knew each other and hung out together. Virginia Woolf and Catherine Mansfield were sort of rivals. I mean, Catherine Mansfield gave Virginia Woolf a bad review in about 1918, which took a couple of years for their friendship to recover from, but they were very much peers. And Arno Schmidt, I bought a sea landscape with Pocahontas in German when I was in Frankfurt. So I've been struggling with that because my German's very, very poor. But just seeing the way he lays out the page, and he does these verbal photographs where he puts a frame around a paragraph and basically describes something in a picture. It's basically an account of a motorbike trip he did in the late 40s with a couple of friends. And it's about two couples kind of exchanging, trading. So I guess it's a bit like Elective Affinities by Goethe. And today I've just bought Frantz Fanon's Les Damnés de la Terre, I don't know what the English title for that is, the Wretched of the Earth, I think it's called in English. And he's a radical black writer, a psychoanalyst, talking about revolution and decolonization and stuff like that. And that looks pretty interesting. There's a chapter here called The Dangers and Attractions of Spontaneity, which is a subject I could probably do one of these lectures on myself. I have a talk coming up here later in the month. Haven't yet programmed. I'm promised a concert as well, but it hasn't yet been scheduled here in Lisbon. And I'll give you more updates when I have more adventures.
Open University.